The kinds of topics that have been discussed in this program over the years have focused both on the Holocaust proper as well as on other examples of genocidal behavior throughout history, with a special relevance to current events. If it were only the case that these were historic only, perhaps we could read more easily. But we're reminded on a daily basis that they are very much with us. And today we're honored to have Mr. Rene van Rooyen speaking to us about the very current events that are going on in Rwanda. And he is singularly well equipped to do so. He is almost a living example of the United Nations, having spent very professional life outside his native country. For 2 years in the early 70s, he worked in Uganda, subsequently moved for 4 years to Malaysia, then spent 2 years in Pakistan, 2 more years in Geneva, 4 years in Bonn, 3 more years in Pakistan, and for the last 4 years has been the representative of the UN High Commission for Refugees in the United States in Washington, D.C. I might say that this is a man who can't keep a job, but that's not the case. These represent successive promotions and increasing responsibilities. I can only say that because I just spent a very pleasant few minutes. I know he has a good sense of humor, even though he's standing behind me here. I don't think he's frowning when I say all of them. But this is a wonderful example of the efforts made by people such as Phil Beard to bring to you distinguished speakers from around the country and indeed the world to address issues that are of vital importance to us as part of this lecture series. And we're delighted that Mr. van Rooyen has found the time in his busy schedule to be with us today. So with no further ado, Mr. Rene van Rooyen.
Thank you very much for the introduction and for the very kind remarks. I would like to start off by thanking the Holocaust Study Center of Sonoma State University to have invited me to come here this afternoon and talk to you a little bit about the United Nations, the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, and in particular the events that are still going on in Central Africa, particularly in Rwanda and Burundi. I would also like to thank in particular Mr. Philip Beard, who, the Faculty Advisory Director, and Mr. Joel Neuberg, who is not present with us today, but 2 people who have, I think, been instrumental in getting me to Sonoma University this afternoon. This afternoon, I would like to break my lecture into 3 parts. I would first of all like to talk a little bit about what the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees is, why it was established, what kind of functions it was supposed to fulfill, and changed over time, how the role of the office changed over time with the changing environment in which it was operating. And secondly, I would like to go in a bit deeper into the current situation in Rwanda, the developments that have led to the flight of over 2 million people. Over 1 million people are in Zaire, and well over 700,000 are in Tanzania. And finally, I would, after I come to a conclusion, I have a small 16 or 18-minute video, which I would like to show, outlining in pictures the work of the Office of the High Commissioner. So let me start off by introducing the office and talking a bit about the background of UNHCR. UNHCR was created in 1951, and it was created as a temporary agency whose primary function at the time was to seek solutions, durable solutions, for a population which was called the displaced persons population of well over 1 million people in Central. The majority of these displaced persons was living in camps in countries like Italy, Austria, and Germany. Repatriation to the country of origin, local integration of the displaced population in the country of asylum, or in the country where they happened to be after the Second World War, and resettlement in third countries out of the country where they were living at the time, and resettling them in a third country, particularly, of course, in countries like the United States, Canada, and Australia, were the three traditional durable solutions available at the time to deal with the displaced population in Europe. I should add that many of the victims, many of the persons at the time in Europe were survivors of the Holocaust. The first High Commissioner was a Dutchman, I am proud to say, Mr. van Herben Goedhart. And he started off the office with in the Palais des Nations in Geneva with 3 rooms and a secretary. Today, UNHCR is occupying a new building just opposite Palais des Nations in Geneva, which was conceived a couple of years ago, and which, at the time that we are occupying it, is already too small for the staff of the office. UNHCR's first mission was to codify international instruments evolved over the previous 20, 30 years, and to incorporate the minimal rights of refugees into international law. That first resulted in the adoption in 1951 of the Convention relating to the status of refugees, which established a legal basis anchored in international law, outlining the rights and duties of refugees in countries which had acceded to the Convention. The 1951 Convention is a European convention and was explicitly limited to persons who had become refugees as a result of events in Europe before 1951. I think it's no overstatement if I say that the convention at the time was conceived by Western governments, not in the last in least, because of a very shameful period in the 30s and the 40s, which led to the extermination of a large number of Jewish and other minorities. The lack of protection for refugees in the 30s and the 40s was, in the 50s, cause for establishing a global or universal refugee definition. It was expected that the task of UNHCR would be accomplished within a very short period. In fact, it was conceived that within 3 years after the establishment of the office, the displaced person population in Europe could be resettled or integrated into the societies in which they were living, and therefore there would be no need for it to continue beyond that. Therefore, UNHCR was given a limited mandate of 3 years. Obviously, after 3 years, the problem wasn't resolved, and other problems came up, and ever since then, the office has been extended for periods up to 5 years. The mandate has been extended for periods up to 5 years, but it still remains a temporary office. UNHCR is, I believe, the only UN agency that has a mandate. It's supposed to work itself out of existence. By the end of the 50s and in the early 60s, and the process of decolonization in Asia and Africa was underway, and it became apparent that the scope of the 51 Convention had to be broadened, which was accomplished through the additional protocols which were added to the 51 Convention, the so-called 1967 Protocol. These protocols made the application of the 1951 Convention they took away the limitations in terms of geographical application of the Convention and in terms of time application. So after 1967, the Convention applied to people not only who had become refugees in Europe before 1951, but also to other people who happened to be outside Europe and had become refugees after 1951. In the 1960s, UNHCR's focus shifted from Europe to Africa. The process of decolonization led to the displacement of millions of people. Armed with the European experience of the 1950s, UNHCR continued to focus integration of refugees into the economies of the countries of first asylum. It is interesting to note that the humanitarian regime, which was adopted in Africa in the 1960s, was much broader in scope than the system established in Europe in the 1950s, and was motivated by the fact that ethnic violence and tribal conflict, rather than state persecution, led to large-scale human displacement. Today, we're living in a different world. We're no longer in the world of the 1950s or the 60s or the 70s or the 80s. In the 1990s, UNHCR has become one of the world's principal humanitarian agencies, with an annual budget of $1.3 billion a year, with offices in about 115 countries, and with a staff of 4,800 men and women who are working in over 130 different, 15 different countries. The total refugee population is estimated today at 23 million, and the total population of displaced persons, people who are displaced from their place of habitual residence but are not outside the borders of their country of origin, are displaced within the country of origin, is estimated at another 25 million. The total population displaced inside and outside borders is therefore somewhere near 50 million people. The present High Commissioner is Mrs. Sadako Ogata, a national of Japan, elected by the General Assembly in 1991, and who was elected just prior to the Iraqi Kurd refugee crisis, which erupted immediately after the Persian Gulf War. Refugees are persons who have left their country of origin because of a well-founded fear of persecution, because of their religious beliefs, their political opinions, their racial and ethnic origins, or their belonging to a particular social group. And there are persons who, owing to such fear, are unable to return to their country of origin. However, in recent times, the responsibility of our office has increasingly shifted and includes also internally displaced persons, as I've mentioned before, i.e. persons who have not crossed borders, who are not outside their country of origin, but are nevertheless in a refugee-like situation. It is also generally accepted now, which was not the case in the 50s and the early 60s, that the Office of the High Commissioner has a role to play in the return of refugees to the country of origin, particularly in their social-economic reintegration in the country of origin, at least in the initial phase. The three main functions of the High Commissioner are to provide international protection to refugees, to coordinate life-sustaining international assistance, and to seek durable solutions for refugees. Allow me first to explain in a very sketchy way the protection component of UNHCR. Traditionally, UNHCR's protection mandate meant primarily the promotion of the accession by states to the international refugee instruments, particularly the 1951 Convention and the 67 protocols, and to monitor state behavior. In recent years, the role of UNHCR's protection function has been taken much more literally and has at times been equal with the physical protection of refugees and displaced persons. The single most important provision in the 1951 Convention is Article 41, often described as the cornerstone of international refugee protection. Article 41 is the so-called non-refoulement principle. It is the absolute obligation of states not to return refugees to the country of origin where their life is being threatened. Both the Convention and the Protocol recognize the principles I have just stated and request that states adopt basic legal and administrative procedures to provide for such protection. As I said earlier, the protection and security of refugees now goes well beyond the question of adoption of these instruments. UNHCR posts teams of protection officers, orders in refugee camps, very often in very vulnerable and difficult situations. They visit prisons where refugees are being detained, and they are present at airports where asylum seekers, refugees are arriving. These protection officers deal with the very real problems of women, children, elderly and unaccompanied minors seeking protection. In the former Yugoslavia, our protection staff acts as a moral presence alongside refugees, the displaced and the besieged population in the midst of war. In the Rwandese camps in Zaire, UNHCR even assures overall physical security using the national Zairian military supervised by international police coordinators. In Myanmar, in what was formerly called Burma, the protection staff verified a safe return of refugees who sought safety in Bangladesh 3 years ago and are now voluntarily returning to their country of origin. Providing international protection to refugees is UNHCR's primary task. While it cannot be measured in the same terms as providing humanitarian relief, it is the most fundamental activity and the raison d'etre of the Office of the High Commission. While protection is most important, many refugees require basic material assistance. UNHCR's assistance activities take mainly place within the following three settings. The first is providing emergency relief in times of major influxes, such as we saw with the Rwandese refugees in the summer of 1994, when over 1 million Hutu refugees fled into Zaire within 48 hours. The emergency response capability of the office has been improved quite substantially over the last several years, not in the least as a result of the frequency of emergencies that are taking place. During the crisis in northern Iraq, when hundreds of thousands of Iraqi Kurds tried to flee into Turkey immediately following the Persian Gulf War, UNHCR caught short of resources and funds and was severely criticized for its failure to provide adequate protection and assistance. UNHCR's preparedness for the 1994 Rwandese crisis was better, as the crisis had been brewing for quite some time before the exodus took place, but was, in the eyes of many, still inadequate. The TV pictures of total desperation, both from within Rwanda and from the refugee camps in Goma, Zaire, continue to be an indictment of the failing international community. However, UNHCR did coordinate an emergency effort of major proportions, relying heavily on the military resources of the donor governments and the close and immediate cooperation of the international non-governmental organizations, who often constitute the loudest critics of UNHCR, but who are also the most important allies of our organization. Despite the explosion of humanitarian activities after the Rwandese tragedy had taken place, and more than 1 million refugees had fled into Zaire, more than 50,000 refugees perished before the international community was able to get the situation somewhat under control, and the alarming death rate in the camps became lower or reached acceptable levels. The second area of material assistance we call simply relief operations. Once an emergency situation stabilizes, UNHCR, along with its partners from non-governmental organizations, such as the IRC, the Oxfam, Save the Children Fund, CARE, supply basic care and maintenance to refugees who require it. and its partners have repatriated over the years millions of refugees back to their countries of origin. To give you examples of the most recent returns, 387,000 Cambodians returned home in 1992 and 1993 from the camps in Thailand, which they had been occupying for the last 13, 14 years. At the same time, more than 2 million Afghan refugees have returned to their country of origin, despite the fact that continued conditions of civil war exist in the country. Last year and a half, UNHCR has assisted over 1.5 million refugees to return to their country of origin in Mozambique. Earlier I mentioned UNHCR's function of seeking durable solutions to the refugee problems. Traditionally, the Office has tried to pursue one of the following 3 durable solutions. There is voluntary repatriation of refugees, which is generally possible only when the reasons why refugees came out in the first place have been removed. And only when the refugees are able to return in safety and in dignity will our Office encourage such return. The second durable solution is in the integration of refugees in the first country of asylum, generally referred to as local integration. And the third possible solution to the situation is the resettlement of refugees to third countries. The Vietnamese boat people case is a case in point of refugees who in large numbers have been resettled in Western countries. Over 1.5 million Indo-Chinese refugees have, over the last 20 years, since 1975, been resettled in Western countries, primarily in the United States, but also in countries like Canada, Europe, Australia, and New Zealand. Since the end of the Cold War, with the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, UNHCR is increasingly shifting the emphasis on the preventive side of our Office. UNHCR is more and more called upon to provide a degree of protection to populations at risk, persons who are still in their country of habitual residence, in the country of origin, but run a high risk of expel. This situation happened with the Iraqi Kurds after the Persian Gulf War, and it is an ongoing situation today, both in Bosnia, where more than 2 million Bosnians are being assisted within their own country, and it is also true in Rwanda. We have to admit, at the same time, that providing effective protection to populations within their own country is extremely difficult. The reputation of the so-called safe in Bosnia or the protected areas in Rwanda are testimony to the fact that providing protection in situations of civil war is extremely volatile and often very inadequate. This brings me to a discussion of events which began just a little over a year ago in the Central African country of Rwanda, a country of roughly 8 million people, the size of the US state of Maryland. Hutus made up about 85% of the population, and Tutsis about 14%. The tragic events of spring 1994 led to a journey into genocide, which resulted in one of the largest and fastest refugee exodus UNHCR has ever witnessed. Before trying to analyze the situation in Rwanda and Burundi and come to some general conclusions on what happened and is happening to these countries, I'd like to give you a brief chronology of the events. On the 6th of April 1994, Rwanda was plunged into an exceptionally brutal outbreak of ethnic violence after the death of its president, Juvenal Habyarimana, in a plane crash. The president of Burundi also died. Both were members of the majority Hutu ethnic group, and they had been to a conference aimed at reducing ethnic conflict in both these countries. It was initially assumed that the plane was shot down by the Rwandese Patriotic Front, the RPF, and a resistance movement founded by Rwandan Tutsis, who had lived in exile mostly in Uganda for the past 30 years. As the crisis developed, it began to appear to many governments and foreign observers that the slaughter of Tutsis, as well as the killing of Hutu moderates within the political elite was being carried out under some sort of a plan. At the same time, diplomats had been aware that members of the Habyarimana, a ruling inner circle, had been very unhappy with the August 1993 Arusha peace accords, which contained compromises with the Tutsi minority. Consequently, the world began to suspect that the president's plane had been shot down by the Hutu militants, possibly members of the elite presidential guard, to specifically sabotage peace agreements. At the same time, the mass killings of Tutsis and moderate Hutus began. At the same time as this began, the RPF launched an offensive and it plunged into chaos and violence. The killings began in and around Kigali, Rwanda's capital. Most observers blamed a predominantly Hutu presidential guard for the beginning of the bloodletting. Not only Tutsis, but Hutu advocates of human rights, Hutu moderates, and the proponents of multi-party politics were also killed. Foreigners on the scene seeing mobs of young Hutu men, many of them drunk, seek out and murder their so-called enemies. Within a week, it has been estimated that 20,000 people were killed in and around the capital, Kigali. Human rights groups blame two Hutu militias for many of the massacres. The notorious Interahamwe, the name meaning those who attack together, and the less well-known Impuza Mugambi, meaning those who have the same goal. This group, reportedly being an armed youth wing of a faction which advocates the total extermination of the Tutsis. At the same time, two extremist Hutu radio stations began propaganda broadcasts exhorting the Hutus to arm themselves and kill Tutsis. Many observers that civilians not previously associated with the extremists were caught up with the fever and the calls to action and participated with great zeal in the killings. Anti-Tutsi violence quickly spread to the countryside. In places such as Butare, near the Burundi border, Changugu, near the Zairian border, and Kibungo, not far from Tanzania. This time, UNHCR was caring for 300,000 refugees from Burundi who had sought previously temporary protection inside Rwanda after the 1993 military coup in the country had provoked them to flee. Those refugees, given the circumstances that prevailed in Rwanda at the time, fled back to Burundi. The UN evacuated most of it now, and governments organized the evacuation of its foreign nationals. Many accused this international retreat of being responsible for fanning the flames of the massacre towards the Rwandan countryside. It is significant in the further development of the genocide in Rwanda to recognize that the international community was well informed about the goings-on in Rwanda, widespread coverage of the civil war by such media as CNN. With Somalia, Bosnia, and other recent large-scale, costly humanitarian operations in mind, the UN Secretary General was told that the international community had to set priorities and that it could not respond to each and every local conflict around the world. Once left, militias were armed with automatic and semi-automatic weapons, grenades, pistols, and machetes. They hunted and killed with impunity. No one could escape, not women, not children, and not the elderly. And anyone who was educated or had shown leadership capabilities was especially targeted for elimination. There can be no doubt massacres of the Tutsis was a well-organized and well-orchestrated effort on the part of the most fanatic Hutu elements to eliminate the Tutsi population in Rwanda once and for all. The Tutsi prefect Survivors report that soon afterwards, the presidential guard arrived and the massacres began in Butare. One eyewitness said the guards dug pits, filled them with burning tires, and threw people live into the infernos. The murdering continued day and night for 3 days. Rights advocates claim that the additional militia dispatched to the south indicate a central control of the massacres. Late in April, the leaders of the militia called upon the comrades to finish what they call nettoyage, or the cleaning up of both Tutsi and Hutu opposition, who had escaped death up to that point. It's called ethnic cleansing in Bosnia. It's called nettoyage in Hutu. The words are different, but the purpose is the same: the physical elimination of an ethnically different minority. Shortly after the militia set up dense roadblocks throughout the areas now controlled by the advancing RPF, the checkpoints were reported to be separated by only a few hundred yards, making escape for the targeted population almost impossible. Countless were killed in their homes, while others were cut down in hospitals and inside churches. Churches, a traditional place of sanctuary in this predominantly Catholic country. Some of the worst incidents have been documented by Human Rights Watch Africa. In Kibungo, 2,800 people gathered in a church were slaughtered in a 4-hour by the Interhamwe using grenades, machine guns, machetes, and R4 rockets. Approximately 40 people survived. In Chihinda, 6,000 Tutsi who had taken refuge in a church were attacked by the militia, who left only 200 alive. 4,000 people were killed in a church in Kibeho, a place where it was earlier referred to, mass place very recently again. 2,000 in Mibirizi, 4,000 in Shangi parish. 500 were slaughtered in the Rukara parish church. Hundreds of patients and staff workers were killed in hospitals and in the larger cities. At an orphanage in Butare, 21 children, singled out because they were Tutsi, were murdered along with 13 volunteers, Rwanda Red Cross, who tried to protect them. In Kongoro, 28 students were slain at their school. This ethnic cleansing continued as random killing increased among the local population, along with banditry and pillage. However, eyewitnesses also report acts of heroism and extreme courage, both civilian and military, in regional areas, many of them Hutu, who sought to shelter and protect their targeted neighbors. Many of these people wound up losing their lives as a result of their acts of mercy. Of course, there were reports during the war of RPF killings and reprisals. However, human rights groups seem to be in agreement that most of these were random acts and not part of a systematic and widespread plan of abuse eradication. And where was the international community while about an estimated 500,000 people were being eliminated? Human rights groups accuse governments of refusing to call the slaughter genocide. They refused to call it by name because to do so would oblige them to act under the terms of the 1948 UN Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of Crime of Genocide, defined as acts committed with the intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. State signatories to the convention are required to prevent and punish genocide as a crime against humanity. On the 29th of April, 1994, Security Council debated for hours before finally adopting a resolution which used the terminology of the Genocide Convention, but still rejected the use of the term itself. However, the UN Secretary General, the Pope, and various human rights groups publicly labeled the slaughter as genocide. During this time, the government of Rwanda held a non-permanent seat on the Security Council and had even been permitted to speak in debate and vote on resolutions concerning Rwanda. The UN peacekeeping contingency, the United Nations Assistance Mission in Rwanda, known as UNAMIR, had already been deployed there before the 6th of April to monitor the Arusha Peace Accord. The mandate was not to suppress the fighting. However, UNAMIR troops protected thousands of civilians around Kigali. By the contingency began to weaken after 10 Belgian soldiers were killed trying to protect the Prime Minister. On the 21st of April, the Security Council voted to slash the operation to 270 personnel against the wishes of the Security Secretary General. A week later, 200,000 refugees streamed across the Tanzanian border within 4 hours. UNHCR had an emergency response team at the border conducting an assessment mission so that we were able to mobilize humanitarian relief fairly quickly. An estimated 10 to 40,000 corpses had by then floated down the Kagera River in the border between Tanzania and Uganda, and many with light behind their backs and showing evidence of mutilation. Photos and videotape of both the refugee outflow and the river bodies appeared around the world. On the 4th of July, the RPF seized Kigali. Days later, 1 million Rwandan, mainly Hutus, fled to Goma in Zaire in a period of 72 hours, obviously overwhelming the capacity of the relief organizations, including UNHCR. By the end of the month, 2 million Rwandans had fled across the border. Hundreds of thousands more were displaced, and an entire social fabric of a country had been ripped to pieces. I was asked by those who run the Holocaust Study Center to shed some light for you today to the recent genocide in Rwanda. In light of the genocide which occurred half a century ago in Europe, known as the Holocaust, which killed 6 million Jews and hundreds of thousands of other minorities. I was asked to look at the relationship between the two events. Before we examine the similarities and differences, before we attempt to compare one tragedy with the other, let us acknowledge certain facts about the Holocaust. The Holocaust is an exceptionally potent symbol and a long episode in recent history which brought about tragic devastation, especially of the Jews. To compare it with other events risks robbing it of its unique significance, not only for its victims, but for mankind. That we can and should acknowledge, before we go on. However, a life is a life. There are many differences between the mass murders in Europe and in Rwanda. The scale of the killings, the history and culture of the region. But most important is the fact that what took place in Rwanda happened 50 years after the full truth of the Holocaust was exposed. With 50 years of study, analysis, 50 years of books, articles, movies, and cries of never again. 50 years later, under the watchful eye of CNN and other instant communications, genocide happened again. The world let it happen again. In a recent article in the Washington Post, Bill Berkeley recalls a conversation with Pierre Claver Rwangabo, moderate Hutu serving in Rwanda's precarious Tutsi-led government, who was shot to death on March the 4th, 1995, by unknown assailants. Evidence suggested that Rwangabo was shot by fellow Hutus, infiltrators from among the 30,000 former Rwandan soldiers and 10,000 allied Hutu militiamen now living among 1 million Hutu refugees in neighboring Zaire. In earlier discussions with Berkeley, Rangabo had reflected on the situation in Rwanda, seeking answers to the question how thousands of ordinary people could have committed such a monstrous crime of killing 500,000 of their fellow countrymen. Rangabo came to the following conclusion. In all the places where the killings took place, the Tutsis and Hutus, they speak the same language, they were sharing everything in their daily lives. Never a Hutu would attack a Tutsi, or a Tutsi attack a Hutu, except where there is a politician behind him. Juvenal Habyarimana, president of Rwanda since 1973, and whose death in a plane crash touched off the killing spree, was a cunning potentate who ruled Rwanda after the model of his mentor Mobutu Sese Seko in Zaire, who initiated him in the affairs of state and above all in the corrupt management of Rwanda. The massacres that occurred in Rwanda were less the result of ancient hatreds than of calculated tyranny. With the end of the Cold War, Western donors were pressuring Habyarimana to democratize. At the same time, he faced an insurgency by the Rwandan Patriotic Front, the RPF, led by Tutsi exiles. Like Mobutu, and like so many other politicians around the world, Habyarimana responded to these dangers, to the dangers of his own political survival by playing the ethnic card. The military began arming and training the Interahamwe. The Hutu militias recruited chiefly from the illiterate peasants and urban unemployed. State-owned radio stations relentlessly fanned Hutu fears of a brutal Tutsi conspiracy to reimpose feudalism and seize Hutu lands. When Habyarimana edged closer to reforms, he fell victim to the monster he had himself created, and as it is generally believed that the plane caused by Hutu extremists. The similarities of genocide are often fairly obvious. The state plays an important role, inter alia, through their control over the means of mass communications. Sometimes the motive of scapegoating a vulnerable minority. There is strong intent and careful planning. The perpetrators select target an ethnic group. They deny members their individuality. They assign guilt solely by membership in that group. A concerted campaign of propaganda denies the group its humanity, dehumanizes the group by demonizing it. The Hutu propaganda referred to the Tutsi minority as the Inyenzi, the cockroaches. No one is immune, not women, not children, not the elderly, and not the infirm. There is often material gain to be realized by eliminating the group. The elimination is systematic and thorough, and as cost efficient as possible. During both tragedies, the international community looked the other way and ignored the cries for help, be it from the Jews trapped on the voyage of the damned, plying the ocean, looking but not finding a safe haven, or the most recent pleas of human rights activists and shockingly gruesome TV video footage. The international community looked the other way because at such times politics becomes more important than people. Let us hope that for one additional similarity between the Holocaust and the genocide in Rwanda. As in the aftermath of the Second World War, the international community sees to it that an international tribunal brings as many perpetrators of these crimes against humanity to justice as quickly as possible. But let us also hope for one last difference between these two tragic events, and that is that the world never does happen again. Thank you. I mentioned earlier on that I have a tape which shows some UNHCR footage on our work globally, which is about an 18-minute tape, I think, which I would like to ask. Maybe you could start the tape, and after that, I would like to open the floor for questions and maybe a discussion.
Loaded with Mozambicans returning home after years in refugee camps. Since the signing of the peace agreement between the government and Renamo rebels in October of 1992, a new chapter of peace and stability has begun.
I'm optimistic, and there is reason for us to worry about new military confrontations in the country. We are doing all the best, politically, economically, otherwise, psychologically, and the whole society is mobilized to try and create a culture of peace in the country.
Confident that this newfound peace will endure, the 1.5 million Mozambicans who had sought refuge in neighboring countries are making the trek back. Mozambique to see for herself this blooming peace. Destroyed during the fighting, the village of Mapabuka's brightly painted clinic, school and church have risen from the ashes of war. Like Mapabuka, there are hundreds of tiny villages each coat of paint, while its children sing about peace and hope. UNHCR, with the help of other relief organizations, is busy rehabilitating the country's basic services: clinics, schools, roads, water wells. Everything that was devastated by war is being rebuilt. This rebuilding is part of UNHCR's 3-year, $203 million program that includes the return of the refugees and their total reintegration. Unfortunately, in other parts of Africa, continue to force thousands to seek sanctuary in neighbouring countries. In April, the downing of the plane carrying the presidents of Rwanda and Burundi sparked the worst bout of ethnic carnage in Rwanda's history. Hundreds of thousands of people were massacred, and millions were forced to flee their homes. Singer barely managed to get across the border to Zaire after escaping the machetes and bullets that took the lives of 10 members of his family. Today, he feels lucky to be able to tell his story to one of UNHCR's emergency officers.
La situation en tout cas était catastrophique parce qu'on tuait tout. Et que ce soit l'enfant, que ce soit né, que ce soit la vieille, que ce soit le vieux. Depuis longtemps, il y a eu des massacres, mais le massacre qui a passé dernièrement, en tout cas, c'est catastrophique.
To respond to the largest and fastest refugee exodus UNHCR has ever witnessed, emergency teams were immediately dispatched to Tanzania, Uganda and Zaire. They arrived loaded with blankets, plastic sheeting, jerry cans and other emergency supplies.
We decided to do a routine monitoring trip to the border, and as we were crossing on the ferry, we looked the 200 or 300 yards up into Rwanda, and all we could see in front of us, right the way across the bridge, right the way up into Rwanda, were people, thousands and thousands of people. The bridge which forms the border between Rwanda and Tanzania was opened for 24 hours 3 days ago, and during those 24 hours, 250,000 people crossed the border. We're in the camp.
To carry out its mandate as providing protection and assistance to refugees, UNHCR must be able to respond immediately to emergencies.
It is a new thing. It started 2 years ago, and I think because the High Commissioner wanted to enhance emergency response for UNHCR following our very bad experience in the Gulf crisis, where we really felt we were not at all prepared. So following that, we were given the mandate to set up a new series of emergency resources, one of which was to create a strong emergency response team who are on standby at all times to be deployed very quickly to the scene of operation.
Tragically, just a few months before, 700,000 Burundis had crossed into Rwanda and other neighbouring countries, fleeing the massacres in their country that was sparked by the murder of the democratically elected president. As the slaughter continued and spread from Kigali to the southern region of Butare, tens of thousands of Burundi refugees fled their camps in a frantic rush to avoid death. Unfortunately, some refugees tried to go home before it's safe. That's exactly what happened to Anastasia. She went back with her husband to fetch a cow they'd left behind. Massive rocketing and bombardment between rival political factions rang in the new year in Afghanistan. Hundreds of thousands of people fled their homes. Some 60,000 people had found relative safety in the Jalalabad area. But as the fighting continued in Kabul and broke out in other parts of the country, the numbers of displaced continued to soar.
1,000 to 2,000 people daily, depending on the day. If
is not so intense in Kabul. We get more people because people can leave.
CR set up a camp on the outskirts of Jalalabad to shelter the newly arrived.
We drew out the layout of this camp and we put our plans into action. We were very badly short of tents, and in a period of 10 days, this is the result.
With the logistics of the camp under control, all attention turned to the dangers and difficulties facing the humanitarian workers. Fighting could spread at any moment to that area. Water was in short supply. Tents were slow to arrive. But all these considerations paled in the face of the thousands of landmines littering the area.
Anti-tank mines.
With famine threatening 500,000 people in Kabul alone, and no obvious political solutions in sight, the appalling suffering of the last 16 years may continue. In Georgia, once one of the richest of all former Soviet republics, tens of thousands of people were forced from their homes by bitter ethnic conflict. UNHCR began its aid program in Georgia in July of 1993, bringing assistance to 150,000 of the most vulnerable internally displaced people from Abkhazia and South Ossetia. Here, recent political developments have given cause.
We will not give them a new complete house, but at least we will give them a possibility to start the new life in Kabul.
The 6-year war over the disputed enclave of Nagorno-Karabakh has taken thousands of lives. More than 1 million people have been made homeless in Armenia and Azerbaijan. UNHCR established operations in both countries in December of 1992 and is now providing humanitarian assistance to 180,000 refugees in Armenia and to some 300,000 in Azerbaijan. Armenia faces the most severe socio-economic decline brought on by a continuing blockade that has left the country nearly without power and fuel. Malnourishment is on the increase as food prices skyrocket. Many residents have been reduced to picking edible plants along roadsides to supplement their meagre diets. In Azerbaijan, conditions are no better, despite the country's rich oil reserves. Much of the country's industry has been made idle by years of war and economic decline. Hundreds of thousands of refugees and displaced people jam old hotels, school buildings, and all other available shelters. Others have had to find shelter in rail freight cars, in tent camps, and in makeshift roadside settlements. These shelters are freezing in the winter months and sweltering hot in summer. The end of the Cold War unleashed many ethnic conflicts that have been brewing for decades. The bloodiest of these tragedies is gen hatred in ex-Yugoslavia. The 2-year ethnic war in Bosnia has forced almost 4 million people to flee their homes. After a glimmer of hope in February, the guns thundered again, this time in Gorazde. During the month-long offensive, the city was under constant fire. At times, it reached one shell every 20 seconds. Hundreds were killed and wounded.
Shells and mortars were landing in the town within 2 days of the offensive starting on the 30th of March. A shell landed within 500 metres of our building, of the UNHCR building, killing 3 people and wounding 12 people. And the local population realised that we were trapped the same way as they were trapped. We were risking our lives as much as they were.
Under international pressure, the siege ended and the wounded were transported to hospitals in Sarajevo and several European countries. But the acceptance in a foreign country of those who are forced to cross borders is not always so generous. In many cases and in many countries, people who are fleeing violence and human rights abuses are knocking on closed doors when seeking asylum.
Virtually all the countries of the world recognize that when a refugee appears at their borders, they should grant them admission, they should protect them from return to danger, and they should respect their basic human rights. One of the problems, though, is the question of, does need to come to my country? Aren't they safe in some other one?
For the tens of thousands of foreigners who've arrived in Russia since the collapse of communism, the reception has been especially difficult. Major economic problems leave few resources for the care of outsiders seeking asylum. In the Mosul alone, there are well over 20,000 asylum seekers. Some live in a handful of accommodation centres scattered throughout Moscow. Others who live on their own receive an allowance, but with $1.50 a day to pay rent, food and other expenses, it's impossible to make ends meet.
Countries need to develop mechanisms to deal quickly and fairly with applications for refugee status, so that there are people who really are...
Refugee camps. The 230,000 Burmese refugees are starting the journey home. The 19-year saga of the Vietnamese boat people is also coming to an end. An increasing number of Vietnamese who spent years crammed in squalid asylum camps in Southeast Asia are voluntarily returning to their country. Lê Long Tien returned home after spending time in a refugee camp in... He used the reintegration assistance grant he received from UNHCR to open a small noodle restaurant. With the help of his mother's cooking, the business is thriving. But refugee problems will be endless unless something is done to address the problem at its source.
So rather than just have a reactive approach and sit there and wait for refugees to come, we need to go and to try to do something before the
lives to bring protection and assistance to more than 20 million refugees and displaced people around the globe.
I think that adds a bit of color to what I said before. As you in color or a religious belief to live amongst us. I would like to open the floor and like to invite you to either comment or make some questions. Yes.
Build the class structure between the Hutus and the Tutsis and led to the big difference.
Well, as in so many other situations, I think Rwanda cannot be, the current situation in Rwanda cannot be separated from the historical developments. And it's true that under the Belgian colonists, although they were only relatively shortly, for a relatively short period, colonial powers, there were mandates under the in the period between the First and Second World War. They took over from the German colonial power the governance of, or the government of Rwanda, Zaire, and Burundi. It's true that during that period, the minority Tutsis were given the ruling power. Basically, they were the ruling elite. They were the feudal minority, a very small minority, ethnically different in principle, ethnically different from the majority Hutus. The Hutus are Bantu-speaking, short, physique different. The Tutsis are northerners, are people from originally from Somalia, probably from the Ogaden, who moved down over the ages in search of water and pasture land for their cows. And they established themselves as a feudal Hutus overthrew the government of the then King Chiberi V, and as a result of these turbulent political events, large numbers of Rwandese refugees, Tutsi refugees, started fleeing into Tanzania and Uganda. As I said before, and as also I think was mentioned in the film, the Rwandese, many of the members of the RPF, Rwandese Patriotic Front, that came back to Rwanda in 1990, 1991, where in fact people who came from the refugee camps particularly in Uganda, and despite the fact that they had been in Uganda, their parents had been in Uganda for almost 30 years, or maybe sometimes over 30 years, the wish to liberate their country, to go back to the country of origin, live as a second-class citizen in Uganda, or for that matter in Tanzania, drove these people back into Rwanda and exacerbated the disintegration of the Habyarimana government at the time. I don't think the RPF is the main cause of, or the main reason why these atrocities took place. I think the end of the Cold War meant that the patronage that some of the totalitarian and dictatorial leaders in Africa had been receiving from Western countries was finished, and it's very likely that the government of Habyarimana would be coming to an end. There was pressure, as I said before, there was pressure on the government to democratize, to open up, and the power positions that they had achieved over the years were at risk. And because of that, they played the ethnic card, which is a volatile, which is an issue that is, of course, in the back of the minds. It's present with many people, but it would not automatically, or it would not by itself, lead to massive killings of minorities. It's fueled, it's fanned, it's organized by, in this particular case, certainly by political leaders who feared for their survival, political survival, and used the minority to incite the majority, incite them against the Tutsis. And of course, the history played a role because many of the Hutus remember that they were second-class citizens in their own country when the Tutsis were in power during the colonial days and under the rule of the kings. But as I said, I don't think that the Hutus by themselves would have come to the conclusion to start massacring if they had not been incited, if they had not been organized, if they had not been given the arms, if they had not go on and on and on. And there's a clear responsibility here. I think the war tribunal that has been established in The Hague in the Netherlands has taken on the case of Rwanda to Yugoslavia. And they will come up with trials and responsibility and assign responsibility where it belongs. Yes?
Who supplied the weapons to the Hutu militias that they used? Why did they supply them?
Well, unfortunately, I must say that around the world, of weapons, there's no shortage of weapons, and there's no shortage of landmines. It's estimated that around the world there are about 100 million landmines left behind by various factions that were fighting each other during the Cold War. And there's no shortage of weapons either. And whereas tribal clashes in the African context were relatively minor skirmishes, they were fought with bow and arrow and spears. In the days of the Kalashnikov, these conflicts have very, very tragic results. But all over Africa, there is, when I was in Pakistan, you could buy a Kalashnikov for less than $50. It was available everywhere. The same is true in many purists, or whatever you call them, who have been incited to take on the cleansing of the society. And but you know, in general, there's no shortage. Of course, there is within all these conflicts. Although we look at them, and we tend to look at them as a local conflict, as a conflict within the confines of Rwanda and Burundi. They have international relations. They have international backers. There are industries, weapons industries, and there are countries that support one faction or another. It's no secret that in the case of Rwanda, particularly the French government, I think, was fairly strongly behind the Hutu majority. Government of Habyarimana, and was bringing to a degree the Hutu population. But arms are available. Arms are readily available. I would say on the open market, you can go out and buy whatever you want. So they're supplied by all parties, by all Western governments that have an interest in selling arms. Yeah.
I understand there are thousands of perpetrators being held in camps right now, young men, that nobody knows what to do with because there's no way they're going to transport them all to The Hague. No one has decided who to go and set up a tribunal in Rwanda, and no one knows what to do with them, and they're actually in very deplorable conditions. So there's the idea that in fact in reverse situations begin to occur. The perpetrators are being.
Well, it's true, and you saw in Kibeo the efforts by the Rwandan government now, which is the Tutsi-dominated government. It has Hutu elements in it, but it's a Tutsi-dominated government, trying to empty out the displaced persons camps in the southern part of Rwanda, massacring thousands of people. It's unknown how many. According to the government, I think there were 200 or 300 dead. According to other sources, there were well over 2,000 and maybe even as many as 4,000 people were killed in the process of emptying out these camps. It's true that the government of Rwanda doesn't really know what to do with the people who are suspected of having participated in massive killings. They have arrested a number of people. They have put them in temporary jails, and they have no system really to deal with the legal side of it. They have no system to bring these people to courts, to judge them, to try them, etc. The idea of the international court is not to bring all the perpetrators to justice. The idea is that they're behind the killings, and the people who were responsible for the killings may not have executed actually the killings, but people who were behind the killings, that they will be brought to justice. And that's probably a relatively small group. Unfortunately, many of those are currently in the camps in Zaire, in the refugee camps in Goma, are hiding within their own population, which has led, strangely enough, a number of, or strangely enough, maybe it's quite understandable, a number of voluntary agencies, including Médecins Sans Frontières, which is a French-Belgian organization, which was providing medical care in the refugee camps in Zaire. They have decided to pull out of these camps because they feel that morally it's untenable to feed the perpetrators of the massive massacres that were taking place in Rwanda. And also it's morally unacceptable to provide assistance knowing that part of the assistance is being used by the same forces in the Hutu leadership to amass the resources to take revenge and probably organize the Hutus to return to Rwanda and take back what they call their country. I think UNHCR is faced with the same moral dilemma.
fully understand the reasons why some of the agencies are in fact deserting the refugees. I think we have no choice as an international organization but to stay with the overwhelming majority of the people who are innocent, who are themselves victims of the circumstances, who have fled and who are now living under very difficult circumstances in those camps. Traditionally, it is the country, the host country, the country where refugees are settling down or enjoy the hospitality of the government. It is the government of those countries that is responsible for separating out the militants or the people who have been responsible for human rights atrocities, take them out and take them to justice. Unfortunately, in the Zaire situation, Zaire is not in a position to take on that responsibility. And that has led to the strange phenomena that UNHCR, for the first time ever in its history, has recruited Zairian military and has organized them under international police supervision, international police officers coming from Ireland and I think from some of the African countries and from the Netherlands, organizing Zairian military to provide security and protection within the camps in Zaire, because the Zairian government has not been able to do that, to take on that function. Very little thought about the growing militias in your country.
I, as a foreigner, as a stranger in this land, I find it amazing that people can organize themselves practically as armies, private voluntary armies with tanks and guns and so on, and go around and do military trainings in forests and so on. I think in none of the other countries in the world this would be allowed. But I think you refer to the Constitution and say that on the basis of your conscience, the Constitution, you have the right to bear arms, and therefore you defend yourself. I think it's to the extent that these movements are becoming anti-government. I think that in my view they're dangerous, but it's something for your government to deal with primarily. They're in a better position.
Zaire is one of the largest countries one of the richest countries also in Africa. It's about, I would think, about this size exactly the border. This is the capital is Kinshasa, which is somewhere. The area what we're talking about is this area. This is Lake Victoria, Uganda, this part. And this small little country, as I said, it's I think the size of Rwanda or so. Small little country, 7 million inhabitants, the most densely populated country in Africa, and one of the most densely populated countries in the world. There are enormous population pressures in these two countries, which has led to outflows. And so this is the region. It's a beautiful part of Africa. I think Churchill called it the jewel of Africa, particularly Uganda. The southern part of Uganda has fantastic views. Great Lakes region. That's also how it's referred to quite often. Yes?
From the point of view of the perpetrators, it's not clear from this vantage point what it was that they wanted. And what do you see in terms of the future for Rwanda, let's say a plot from here to 5 years from now?
What started led to neighboring countries. It took place in the 70s, in the 80s, and in the 90s.
But on this scale, it has never happened before. And I think it
very difficult to imagine at this stage the future of Rwanda, to imagine a peaceful cohabitation of the two populations. On the other hand, it must be said that despite all the cruelty and all the massacres that have taken place, there are Hutus, there are moderate, certainly moderate Tutsis. I think one of the basic elements has to be that there cannot be a continuation of a Tutsi domination of the majority population of Hutus. It has to be a more democratic, open society than it was before, with obviously protection of the minority. Now, whether the minority is willing to seize its power, which it currently has, is very doubtful. I don't know what the future of these two countries, in particular of Rwanda, is. Of course, they need to start living together again. Resources in the country are extremely limited. To bring back the 1 million Hutus, or the 2 million Hutus are now outside their country, it's going to be extremely difficult. Question was, why did this happen? I mean, that basically, again, I mean, it's a power question. It's a question of people who had been accustomed to enjoy the fruits of power for a long period, fearing that they would have to give it up. After all, the Arusha peace agreement that had been reached in 1993 foresaw a sharing of power between the Hutus and the Tutsis. And that's why the war, the RPF had attacking. There was a ceasefire in place. There was talks going on, and there were moderate Hutus who were willing to start a dialogue and hopefully come to an agreement with the Tutsi leadership. And that was prevented from happening by the plane crash and by the attack on the president, who, in the eyes of the Hutu fanatics, continuous propaganda and demonizing of the Tutsi population. Now, the fact that this ethnic strife already existed, plus the fact that the Tutsi Tutsi-led RPF was gaining ground and was making headway and was coming back in Rwanda as a possible force, not as a possible force, but as a possible, the dominant political force, exacerbated the situation, I think, because it lent credence to the propaganda that was made that these people are coming back to take back the feudal positions, to take back their land, to take back their houses, to take back everything, to put you down as a
separate. I mean, you see how small Rwanda is. Making it even smaller is I don't know. First of all, it would strengthen the hands of the people who are opposed to. Traditionally, the people have been living together. There is no. It's like Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia have been living, and the number of intermarriages, the number of people, Croats and Bosnians who've intermarried, or Serbs and Bosnians who've intermarried, is enormous. There is no basic sentiment of resentment or hate, but it can be stirred up, obviously, and it was in the case of Yugoslavia, and in the case of I don't know. I don't think that
were allied with the Allies, traditional enemies that went back many, many years. Now, what is the relationship, in your mind, in your opinion, what is the relationship of that situation of 45 to what's going on today?
Well, it has some relationship, I think. saying is that one has to be very, very, I think, aware of political forces that try to manipulate these very raw sentiments that exist in many of us, in fact, the sort of tribalistic sentiment of belonging to a particular exclusive group. I think we all have a bit of that in ourselves. And I think once
alone to take action against the shelling within Genocide.
Excuse me, could you repeat the question?
Well, you mentioned the word protect, right?
Yeah.
And from my understanding, it took Commander Rose, the UN ground commander,
yeah.
It took us quite a bit of time to react to the shelling of that city, Genocide.
Yeah.
What do you think going on?
But you know, the rules of engagement and the mandate of the UNPROFOR, which is not the same as UNHCR, but UNPROFOR in Yugoslavia are very, very limited. And you know, it's always easy to blame an individual for that. But I think Rose is acting within the confines of the mandate that he has been given, and it's the Security Council that gives him the mandate. And I think the 5 permanent members of the Security Council are basically, you know, responsible for what kind of mandate he's being given. So therein, I think the UN, the UNPROFOR is very limited. We, as I mentioned in my talk earlier on, we have developed notions of safe haven and protected zones, etc., in the context of Zaire or in the context of Yugoslavia and some other refugee situations. Obviously, those notions of protection need to be looked at again, because in the case of Yugoslavia, the so-called safe havens are not very safe, and they're not very havenly either. So if you're not able to provide the protection that you pretend to provide, then you better not say that you're providing it. Yes?
What's your sense of the current atmosphere in Washington among Canadian politicians regarding, well, in the broad sense, the future of the United Nations, and what role do you play in trying to affect that debate?
Well, in general, there is I think I'm not saying anything a secret. There is an anti-UN sentiment, not so much in the, or not certainly not in the executive branch of the government, but in the legislative branch of the government, in both houses. There is a negative sentiment on the UN. It relates a little bit to some of the thinking that was, you know, some of the question about the militias. Some of the notions that I've heard that the militias are spreading is that the UN is taking over power and so on in the United States. And some of the people on the Hill, Mr. Helms, for example, has been indicating similar, and I don't want to make a connection here between him and, but has been indicating similar resentment that, you know, the sovereignty of the United States being undermined, etc. And it's sort of trying, or going back to a sort of isolationist position. And the exception, I think, in all this is the rest of the UN. All these things are interrelated. You either have a functioning UN, and I think there are many reasons, it's fair to say that the UN has a lot of failings, but it's also fair to say that it's been thrown into a role since 1989, since the end of the Cold War, that it was not really prepared for which it doesn't have the resource, for which it doesn't have the manpower, etc. Nevertheless, I would be the first to agree that there are many failings of the UN, but you can't have UNHCR as a sort of organization that we are willing, because of its humanitarian nature, etc., willing to support, but singling out UNHCR from the rest of the UN and say that peacekeeping is rubbish, and this is rubbish, and that is rubbish. UNHCR can only exist if the other arms of the UN are well developed also. The peacekeeping, the political, the humanitarian, the various other aspects. Developmental, many of the root causes of large-scale situations, obviously grounded in failing developments, economic developments in many parts of the world. So we need all these together, and I would not be happy to continue to have the support of the Congress for UNHCR's operations and see the support for the rest of the UN withering away. I think it is an all-inclusive package that we need to support. That is all the elements of the UN, with the reasonable doses of critique, and but nevertheless, I think there's no alternative. In my view, no alternative but to continue to support the UN and make it better.
The film raised the question: where is the international community? And I think you raised that earlier. About the foreign community. Do you think this needs more UN support for problems like the Rwanda?
Well, to the extent that there are regional organizations that can provide support, let regional organizations do it. But I think from the point of view of our mandate, we have no choice but to get engaged whenever there is a large-scale refugee situation developing. And that means even if it's a small-scale refugee problem, relatively small as the Haitian, we as UNHCR, we have to speak up and say that people need protection if they need protection. And you can't just turn your back to them and say, look, today our boat is full. We've heard that story too often, that the boat is full. So we have no choice. Our mandate is very clear. We have to step in and provide assistance to victims of persecution. So I think the UN will probably continue to be involved in all these situations. I also think that we are at a bit of a historical cross point. The paradigm that existed in the 1970s and 80s, and in fact has existed for the last 40, 50 years of an antagonistic bipartisan world, one camp on this side and another camp on that period of history is over, and we're in a new phase in which nobody really knows what the new paradigm will be, but where a lot of uncertainty is existing, and I think a lot of possibilities exist, but these countries are of no relevance anymore in the global strategic thinking, and therefore they all of a sudden see their support, financial support, dropped. Their leaders fall from power, and there's chaos in the country. And that will happen for some time, I think. There are a number of countries which probably will follow the example of Somalia and to extent basically all states. And we haven't found that yet, I think. And I think that's one of the reasons why we are confronted so much these days with failing states, disintegrating states, populations being pushed out of countries, etc., etc.
In regard to our program here, and the aim which we can perhaps contribute towards knowledge, sensitivity, understanding of world situations, which, as you have described, are exceedingly complex. Do you have any suggestions for we as individuals, plus the program we have here, could do in making a contribution to strengthen give some sort of a support to the organizations and institutions which could make a difference, could make an input which would be substantive or at least worthwhile?
Well, first of all, I would like to say that this lecture series is a contribution. I mean, looking at the Holocaust not exclusively in its historical significance, but also in its current significance, and looking at situations
that have a similar meaning, I think is an important contribution. I think individually people have a responsibility, and I would think individually people have a responsibility to understand what's going on globally and in their own country. I think political awareness is a factor. You have your political rights, and you have your political representation, and you have your means of influencing your politicians. And many Americans do that. And they write to their congressmen, they write to their senators, and they tell them that positions they are taking are not the positions that reflect the ideas of them. So that is a contribution. What else? Organizing yourself or becoming involved in international affairs, I think, is another possibility.
Course on campus that you can also take 2 different United Nations courses here. One is the theoretical in the political science department and history department, and one is the actual practice where you go to Stockton to the Student United Nations, where you learn the rules, parliamentary procedure, and so forth of the United Nations, and you can consider a career in some kind of international United Nations arena. So think about that.